Welcome to the Elitist Geek. I'm your host, Epix911. Today, we're going to dig deep into the mists of time to trace the history of the first 3D games. I was reading a forum today where some youngsters were under the impression that Mario 64 was the first 3D game. Yeah, no. In fact, the history of 3D games goes so much further back, and it's so much richer than the Nintendo 64 days. Today, 3D accelerated games are mainstream. We are at the dawn of the launch of true head motion tracking virtual reality. But where did it start? What led to the rise of 3D games? To find out, we need to go back to before the era of video games, back to a time when pinball machines and electromechanical machines ruled the roost. So sit back and take a ride with me, back through the history of 3D games. In 1966, Sega created an electromechanical game called Periscope. What separated Periscope from other games of the time was the unique way it invited players to view the game action. Players would put their head up to a mechanical periscope that mimicked the feeling of being an actual submariner. This, it can be argued, was the first foray into what would later evolve into virtual reality goggles. The next step in the evolution took another 12 years and came from a video game publisher, Midway, who created an updated version of Sega's Periscope called Sea Devil. Sea Devil took the electromechanical game functions and expanded on them, although it itself was still an electromechanical game. The next advance towards the modern 3D we enjoy today came in 1978 from publisher Exidy and their game Starfire. Starfire was a blatant cash-in on the then 2-year-old Star Wars movie, and even took bits of Battlestar Galactica, a sci-fi TV series of the day which can be argued was itself a Star Wars cash-in attempt. Starfire was a pseudo 3D game and was the first to invite players to sit in an actual cockpit. Another step to allowing players to experience virtual reality. Atari soon followed suit with their 1979 home console release of Star Raiders on the Atari 2600. Star Raiders was a game that had players battle other Star Raiders and protect their home bases. So in October of 1980, we would have had games with either a periscope, unique control joystick, or pseudo 3D, but nothing that put it all together in one package, until the following month. In November of 1980, Atari released a game called Battlezone. It was a vector graphics game that was pseudo 3D in its presentation. However, what separated Battlezone from other games of the day was the unique way in which players interacted with the game. Players used a gunner yoke joystick to control their gun turret, a yoke that was later used in Star Wars, the arcade game, but more on that later. What really set Battlezone apart from other games was the way in which players viewed the game. Just like Starfire in previous years, players stepped up to a viewing goggle, but this viewing goggle, it could be argued, would make Battlezone the first virtual reality game. After the release of Battlezone, and slightly before, we had games which used what is called step-based 3D. Games like Maze War in 1973, and later games like Richard Garriott's RPGs Alcalabeth and Ultima used this for their dungeons in 1979 and 1980, as did the RPG Wizardry in 1981. In fact, Wizardry and Ultima spawned all the Japanese RPGs we love so dearly today, and even the ones we don't. But that is a topic for another video. In 1980, Microsoft released its Flight Simulator 1, which made use of the vector graphics technology on the Apple II. It ran almost like a slideshow presentation and was about as far from actually flying a plane as drawing a picture of one and holding it in front of your face. But it was digital, and it was a start. In 1982, we saw the release of a home console dedicated to displaying games using the new 3D Vectrex-style graphics. That was none other than the Vectrex game console. It featured 3D titles like 3D Crazy Coaster and Pole Position. Riding on the vector graphics craze at the time, 1983 saw the release of Atari's Star Wars Arcade, which also featured vector graphics and recreated the movie's pivotal Luke Skywalker and Death Star attack scene. The next truly 3D game was a hit, and it could be argued created the next paradigm shift in 3D gaming. That title was Elite, released in 1984 by David Braben and Ian Bell. In this game, players took on the role of a Mark III Cobra pilot and set out in a mathematically generated 3D space system to build their fortunes, upgrade their ship, and attain the illustrious title of Elite. This game was jaw-dropping for the time, and it featured things we now take for granted in space games. Things like docking your ship at a space station, dogfights with other ships. What 3D games were still missing, however, was something that players could relate to. You see, it was easier for home computers, arcades, and consoles of the time to pull off space-based games, as the play environment was limited. The programmer only had to account for enemy ships, stars, and planetary shapes. What games were still not capturing was a world environment. All that was to change later in 1984 with the Electronic Arts published Skyfox. Skyfox not only presented the game in bitmap graphical form, but it brought the gameplay down to the planet's surface. Changing game elements from non-shaded polys like Vectrex to bitmap graphics gave the game added color depth and realism. This game was the wing commander of its day and provided all the visceral, in-your-face dogfighting any virtual ace pilot could wish for. In 1985, NovaGen Software developed a game called Mercenary that would bring Elite-style graphics of outer space and finally connect them to the ground. This was a game that used wireframe graphics, but was the first game to give what me and my best friends still refer to as the Mercenary on Targ effect, which is the feeling of falling from a great height that for someone with a fear of open heights like me would give me that weak-kneed feeling of actually falling. Sure, it looks primitive as all fuck today, but back then it was the state-of-the-art simulator for the sensation of falling, bar none. Then, in 1987, a game company called Incentive Software published a title called Driller. Driller brought all the graphical elements of a game like Elite, but with the added shaded polygons and a planet surface. It was a puzzle game where the player had to avoid the sweeping beacons of light and stick to the shadows to solve a series of puzzles. What makes this game so important in our discussion is that it was arguably the first game to use what we would now refer to as a 3D engine. The engine Driller used was called the Freescape engine, and it allowed for the production of a full three-dimensional environment with the aforementioned filled polygons in which the player could move freely. Not only could the player look left and right, but they could look up and down as well. This was a rare feature among 3D games of the time. This engine was used to create a string of 3D games, like Castle Master, a 1990 game which was a popular title on the 16-bit machines of the time.